The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to the 13th chapter of St. Luke. At that time, some Pharisees came to Jesus and said to him, "Leave this place and go somewhere else. Herod wants to kill you." Jesus replied, "Go tell that fox I will keep on driving out demons and healing people today and tomorrow. And on the third day, I will reach my goal. In any case, I must press on today and tomorrow and the next day, for surely no prophet can die outside Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Christ. Please be seated. I want to ask you to please take out your pew Bibles. I meant to do this before Colin read for us, but I really want you to spend some time with me in this scripture from Genesis 15. It was page 20, I believe. For those of you who forgot, Genesis is right at the front. You know, when I was finishing up college, as you're looking for that, Genesis 15, 1 through 12, 17, 18, I was reflecting on this recently. My son is a senior at Wartburg, and he's in this same process right now. I was finishing up my senior year in college, and I was talking with God a whole lot about what I was supposed to do in life, what I was called to do, what my future would hold, where I was going. And there's lots of questions that surge up inside of that. And one thing that I clearly recall was the amount of doubt and insecurity that raised up in me as I entered into those questions. You know, I just spent thousands and thousands of dollars on this education. Am I going to use it? Will it make a difference? Will I be able to do something worthwhile in the world? And so it's interesting because my conclusion was not, in fact, to go on to med school. Even though I had taken the MCATs and everything, I decided to take a year off, and I went to Appalachia. And I lived as a lay missionary in a little town of 97 people. You've maybe heard me talk about this before. I left my family. I left everything I knew. I left my securities, my friendships, and I went to live in Ohio, saying to God, "Show me. Change me, transform me, do something significant in my life." And while I was there, you know, I was primarily engaged in living in a small Catholic church community, but I ran a food pantry and a clothing store, similar like St. Vincent de Paul, where people could come in and get clothing, or they could come in and get in food goods. And I also took them out to the people who lived out in the Appalachian foothills. And it was a really remarkable year, but, you know, shortly before Christmas, I remember I started to really miss home. And I started to think about the holiday, and I wasn't going to be back in Iowa for Christmas for the first time. And I started to miss my friends. And I felt a kind of a darkness start to come over me. I started to get a little angry. I had a harder time getting out of bed in the morning. Winter was coming on. It was darker and dreary. And I wallowed in this for a while. It was really starting to affect how I interacted with the other members of the Anamosa community. I was not joyful. I was not treating people well. I was snappy and snippy and short-tempered. And I finally decided to call my friend John back at Loris College, who happened to be a priest on faculty there, but he had been a good friend to me. And I told him about what was going on with me. And he simply asked me at some point in the conversation, he said, Rodney, can you see past all of this? Can you see something that God is doing in your life? Can you imagine what that might be beyond this darkness? And I really sat with that. That felt like a really significant question to me. And as I sat with it, I kind of opened myself up again to God, saying, God, what are you doing in me? What are you doing around me? What are you doing through me? Help me to imagine it. Because if I could imagine it, I could live into it. And that helped me to persevere that year in Appalachia. And it helped me to start a new ministry with the youth of that church. And I took a group of them to Columbus, Ohio. They hadn't been out of the Appalachian foothills. And I took them to a big church event with other youth. And they met other youth and they got fired up and inspired. And we went back and did a service trip there. We went on text there. And one of those girls actually went on to become Miss Teen Ohio, because she experienced a new life. And so new life came out of that trust that I placed in my imagined future in God. I was reminded of that story because of what I read with Abram today. And this is where I want you to join me in this story from Genesis, because I think it's a really significant story about our father in faith. And this truly is his experience of becoming our father in faith. And when I say faith, I'm not talking about some intellectual exercise where I give my assent to something. I'm talking about faith that causes me to trust, that asks me to place my trust in something else. And that's what's at the heart of this story today. So let's look at this for a second. We started in verse 5. Actually, we're invited to start in verse 1. And it follows this long journey that Abram had been on. You know, he left his home in Ur of Chaldea, which is Mesopotamia, in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the cradle of civilization. About 1700 BC, he left and he followed the voice of a God that he was just meeting. This was not the God of his forefathers, not the God of his clan. This was a new God. This was the one God, Yahweh God. I am who am. And he invited Abram to leave what he knew to find something new. And Abram committed himself to that. And he took his nephew Lot with him, and his wife, and his father, and their herds and their servants. And they traveled north to Iraq, up to Haran. And they lived there for several years, listening to the voice of Yahweh. And then Abram's father died. And he felt, this is not where I'm meant to be. And God said, I will take you to Canaan. He traveled through Syria and down through the edge of Lebanon, down into what is now Israel, down through the Jordan Valley. And they stayed there for a while, but then a famine broke out. And they ended up all the way down in Egypt, through the Sinai Peninsula. And there in Egypt, we hear that story where he tells Pharaoh, this isn't my wife, this is my sister. And Pharaoh takes her as his own wife. But in the process, Abram becomes wealthy. Pharaoh says, thank you, and bestows gold and silver and servants and flocks on him. And then Pharaoh finds out Sarah is actually his wife. And he says, why'd you lie to me? And Abram says, I thought it would save my life. It did. And Pharaoh, in disgust, gives Sarah back to Abram, and they head back to Canaan with their wealth. And so he comes back to the land of promise, the land of Canaan, Israel, and the southern part of it. And he settles there. And his and Lot's flocks are so big, their servants' number so great, they can't get along anymore. And so Lot and Abram split and part ways. Lot goes down to Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram stays up in the Negev desert on the south edge of Israel. And while he's there, he has this conversation with God. He says, look, God, I have so much stuff, but I'm missing one thing, an heir. I don't have a son to give it to. My lineage is going to die with me. All of this stuff is going to go to a servant in my household. And God says, don't worry, Abram. I will be your God. I will be your stronghold. I will be your safety. And Abram says, how do I know this to be true, God? He has a little bit of doubt about this. And so God takes him out of his tent. And this is where we pick up in our story today. This is verse 5. God takes him out of his tent and stands him outside and says, Abram, look up at the sky. Can you count the stars? Count them if you can, because that's how many descendants you will have. Now, you have to imagine in Abram's heart, he's saying, this doesn't make sense, God. I'm a shepherd. I know how this whole, productivity thing works. Sarah and I don't have any children. I'm 100 years old, 90 years old. She's postmenopausal. How are we supposed to have children? How can this become true? God says, look at the sky, Abram. Now, one of the things that's really significant about this story that we sometimes miss is a little bit later, in verse 12, it says, the sun started to set. So when God took Abram out of his tent and had him stand outside, what time of the day was it? It was the afternoon. He's looking up at the sky. Can he see the stars? No. But he knows they're there. How does Abram know the stars are there? He's seen them in the darkness. If you've ever been in the desert at night, no electricity, that's what it was like in 1700 BC. Dark is dark, and the sky filled with stars is magnificent. A carpet from horizon to horizon. And so Abram's imagination is like, wow, God, I can imagine them there, but I can't see them. And God says, do you trust me, Abram? And Abram says, I trust you, God. And God counted it to him as righteousness. And then God says to him, oh, by the way, Abram, I'm going to give you this land from the Wadi of Egypt, from the Nile River of Egypt, all the way over to the Euphrates for your descendants. And Abram's like, wow, how do I know I'm going to possess it? And God does something very significant for him to shore up his trust in him. God does this very interesting ritual, if you notice. He says to him, bring what? A heifer and a goat and some pigeons, and cut them in half. What this refers to is what was called a suzerainty pact. In that day and age, occasionally a conquering tribe would have mercy on another tribe. And instead of slaughtering them, instead of wiping them out, instead of removing them from memory, they would have mercy on them and they would say to them, we will form a pact with you, and here's how we will form the pact, the covenant. We will place animals cut in half on two sides, and then the leaders of our tribes will pass through those animals. And the message is, if I break this pact, if I break this covenant, may this happen to me and my people. So think of the significance of that, walking through the leaders of the tribe, now covered with the blood of the animals. And Abram sees God offer him this covenant. His God is extending mercy to him. The great and powerful God extending mercy to Abram. And in the midst of this, Abram experiences what? His conditions of creation. And he says, how can I possibly respond to God in a good way? I'm human. I'm limited. I lack control. And anxiety comes up in Abram. He's filled with a dreadful darkness that settles on him. As he reflects and asks himself, can I say yes to God? Can I say yes to a God who offers me a covenant of land and descendants? Can I imagine it? And in the midst of this trance that falls on him, in the midst of this dreadful darkness, he has a dream, he has a vision that God, in the form of a pillar of fire, it's a brazier. Remember, these were nomads. These are Bedouins. And they carried their fire with them from camp to camp. And that's how they experienced life. As long as they kept that fire going, they had life. And that was one of the presences of God for them. We hear about it when they're in the desert after the Exodus. How is God with them? Pillar of fire by day, or pillar of fire by night, cloud by day. That's what Abram sees in this vision. God passing through the animals. God ratifying the covenant with him. And Abram looks at it and says, wow, my God is with me. We all have periods of darkness. We all have periods of doubt, where our conditions of creation flood over us and veil us with darkness. Our insecurities, our doubts, our weakness, our limitations, our lack of control leads to an anxiety that can sometimes paralyze us. But our God, like Abraham, comes to us as a covenantal God of love and mercy. How did Abram respond to that darkness ultimately after having his vision? He trusted God. He gave his faith to God. He allowed God to bring about what he imagined to be true. Those stars that came to him in the darkness. He needed the darkness to even be able to imagine what God was offering him. And he trusted God to make it true. What do you turn to when you experience the veil of darkness, when you experience your condition of creation? So many people turn to alcohol and violence and drugs and pornography and more work. They turn to things out in the world. They turn to themselves to try to gain some kind of sense of power, of accomplishment, of control. But what we're shown in Abram today clearly is that we have one response that is life-giving. And that is to trust our God. To look to God for that unimagined future. You know, I think of Abram and maybe even ourselves as people who are in 12-step programs. You know, I've not personally walked the 12 steps, but I know as I've talked with people in 12-step programs, you come to face every day with that decision. Am I going to trust a future that I can only imagine? I can't see it, but I can imagine it, and I need to trust my higher power to help me make it happen. That's what we're invited to every day in our faith life. Every day we walk in this world. To trust our God in the midst of our darkness, to bring to life what we can only imagine. And so today, as you think about the invitation of a God who is covenantal, you can imagine what Jesus was experiencing in this gospel story that we heard today. And I would invite you to go home and to read this again. This exchange between Jesus and the Pharisees, who are acting like his friends, who are constantly trying to trip him up and dishonor him and discredit him. Now they throw Herod under the bus. Herod's trying to kill you. Jesus, you better run away. Oh, that would be convenient for them, wouldn't it? Because they would be rid of him. Because he's a threat to them. But Jesus reminds them, oh no, I see right through your veiled attempt to scare me. Sure, go back and tell Herod, ooh, I'm quaking. No, I'm going to stay right here in Jerusalem, and I'm going to keep doing the work of healing and casting out demons and bringing about forgiveness and good news to the marginalized today and tomorrow until my mission of love is accomplished. You go tell him that. And I know how this is going to turn out. You will have to kill me to get rid of me. But then again, that's what you always do to people who threaten you. That's what you always do when the veil of darkness descends upon you. You turn to violence. Could you see another way forward? See, that's the thing, is Jesus was showing them every day another way forward, a different future that they couldn't imagine under the law. But the gospel of love and compassion provides another way forward. Unity, togetherness, lifting people up. This is what threatened the leadership. This is what leads to violence. This is what Jesus knows will happen in Jerusalem. And yet, we know his own doubt and darkness crushed him to the ground in Gethsemane. He was not without worry. His humanity suffered. His creation was filled with anxiety. But we hear in that prayer of Jesus, God, your will. I don't know exactly what that is, but your will. Help me to live into that imagined future of resurrected life. And he stood up and took the next step forward. What will be your next step in trust and faith today?